So we're continuing with regional economic integration and we're looking at the Benton and Isaac paper. So the first question that they ask is, why is there a need for regional economic integration or cross-border trade? So the first idea is that you'll be able to distribute any surplus production that you have, especially in the terms of staple foods. Then they also have the idea that you can trade in basic manufacturers such as metal and plastic, especially considering that basic manufacturing has increasing costs, especially when you look at importing from the rest of the world. So it's very costly to actually import basic manufacturers. So if you're able to deal with your neighbor and that should save on costs. And at the same time, if you're dealing with your neighboring countries and that, then maybe forming some regional production chain would be better than taking your raw materials, selling it to a foreign country like China, letting them produce it and process it, and then sell back to you for a very expensive cost. So trying to work with your neighbors should be a bit more better in using your raw materials. Another idea for regional economic integration, why the need for it, is that you will have a variety of goods. And then there's the whole idea of untapped potential for exports. Especially considering that if there's a really low regional economic trade, then with forming these regional economic integrations and agreements and that, by increasing the regional trade, that's potentially more exports. And if you work as one unit in terms of production chains, then as one unit and producing at a cheaper rate, there's potential for you to increase your trade with foreign countries. So if it is important and there is a need for it, then there's a need to look at your policy and try to remove some of these unnecessary barriers or create policy that doesn't create unnecessary barriers. So your first thing you have to look at is looking at simplifying cross-border trade for small informal traders. So you help them in terms of moving their product across the border. You try to reduce the amount of agency at the border because the least amount of agents that you need to deal with, the less time spent there, and less fees having to be paid. And then also looking at increasing the professionalism of officials. So trying to remove the bribery and that and pushing other people forward in the line and all those type of things. So that is important to look at. And then we also need to help with supporting trade associations. So we address those issues that might help with simplifying cross-border trade. Another thing to look at addressing is the non-tariff barriers, removing that. And if you remove those, then usually speaking, that means tariffs are reduced. And by reduction of these tariffs, it will actually help with economic development. So some of the issues faced under non-tariff barriers is the rules of origin. Telling a country who's trying to sell you a product or good, telling them that you need to at least produce 40% of the good from us or something like that. So that obviously hampers trade with the country. So you don't have any import tariffs, but you tell them, wait, you need to have some percentage of your good produced by us coming from us in some form. And then we also need to address the idea of export bans that exist, preventing countries from importing towards you or within the region or from your neighboring region countries. And then also looking at the ideas of export and import licensing. Because sometimes then you limit the amount of product coming by having this type of licensing. And then another idea in terms of policy, to prevent this unnecessary barriers is to look at reforming regulations and immigration procedures. So this will maybe help with potential trade and investment in services. Moving on to the composition of regional economic trades. So what has been our trades in a sense of, even though there's been these regional economic chains or regional economic agreements, what has happened is a lot of our trade has been in terms of trading with China. So we trade more with China. What do we have mostly traded with them? It's mostly private commodities, and it's usually been of a low value, of a very capital intensive nature, or the production has been more capital intensive. So if something's more capital intensive and that is where our market is growing, that means we're not using a lot of our local labor. So you can expect that employment levels to be very low. So we need to try to move to commodities and products that which will use more people. So we maybe could concentrate in improving conditions for informal firms. So those are the firms that work with outside the law, or either not governed by government in a sense, and maybe trying to increase the opportunities for them to interact with the formal sector, and will maybe provide them a path to become formalized. So another, looking at the composition of regional economic trades, as we all know, there's very low inter-regional trade. So if we're looking at low inter-regional trade, the one way that we can help with maybe increasing production in labor-intensive goods and those of more higher valued nature is maybe by trying to relax the constraints of inter-regional trade for firms. So that may help in that sense. You could also then address the overlapping regional economic integrations that exist. So belonging maybe to SACU and maybe belonging to another type of organization or another type of regional trade. So you belong to multiple regional agreements, and what that usually does is that the rules are not the same amongst these organizations, and so that usually maybe increases costs. So if you then try to reduce this overlapping by either belonging to one or combining two or three of these regional agreements together, then you might help with addressing these multiple rules and this increasing cost. Also find in terms of the looks of our regional economic trades that we have high costs in Africa. Our transaction cost is really, really high. It's maybe because in general, if you look in terms of the world, there's more production chains to help to reduce costs. And they also have low communication costs. So that is helpful for the rest of the world. And Africa hasn't followed in the same vein. So what is our scope for cross-border trade? Is the potential, can we actually create cross-border trade? So in the first sense, we have similarity of endowments. So what is similarity of endowments? How is that going to help us if we have similar endowments? Well, in terms of it being agricultural goods, we have varying weather and seasons among African countries. So growing food at different times of the years in different ways is not going to really hamper each other. Having similar endowments also allows us to team up and work together and trying to grow or have a production to the rest of the world in the sense that we're working together. Looking further at the agricultural side, if you look at what our strength is in terms of Africa, 3/4 of the world output in terms of food is from Africa. And with integration in Africa, if there was more urbanization and more population growth, we would expect that the need for more food would increase. So having the power on the food side is important. But what do we know? The returns for foods and pricing around foods has not been in favor. Primary goods, terms of trade is not favored. But the terms of trade in manufactured goods is favored, which is strangely considering that this is where we actually have a big strength. We also then need to address issues like looking at the informal cross-border trade. This is not really measured and this is not really valued. And if you look at it through certain studies, we found that it's about 50 to 60% of formal flows. This is what the value of informal trade is in a sense across borders and that. So, I mean, it's almost about half, almost to 100% of what the formal version of the trades are. And it is actually quite valuable to measure and then to assist and to allow to grow in a sense. So that is something we need to consider. And then we also need to look at the idea of having a basic manufacturing sector grow as Africa develops. As you all know, looking at and reducing the cost in basic manufacturing things, especially in terms of importing it from foreign countries, is expensive. So now, if you address that in terms of your regional trades and trying to grow that sector, then you might save long term on costs related to this types of production. Also, the terms of trade favoring the manufacturing sector is also an important thing to consider here. So starting to grow your manufacturing sector as your regional economic trade starts picking up is an important thing then to look at. The other idea then in terms of the scope is to look at regional production chains. Similar things like what Asia has done. We have, like them, inexpensive labor. And then we also have expertise in certain sectors or certain countries that have that expertise where they can step in and out. So what we're trying to do with production change is to move away from specialization in production and rather to efficiencies in certain stages of production. So you're not having one country producing one entirely thing. What we're doing is saying, okay, we have three countries, maybe South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Namibia. South Africa is most efficient in this stage of the production. Zimbabwe is most efficient in this stage of the production. And then trying to create our chains that way. And we also find that in terms of production chains, South Africa is very good at the logistics side and the capital side, and they can compete globally with that. So for them to provide that expertise together with some of the other African countries which have cheap labor, maybe then that is a way to create these regional production chains. But in order for that to happen, we need to really remove the restrictive trade barriers and the restrictive policies. In more things to do with scope is looking at trade-in services. So if we look at Uganda, Uganda is really good in the education service. So maybe being the feeder in terms of educational stuff is an important thing to look at. If we look at Nigeria in terms of financial institutions, so they can maybe provide the trade-in service in the form of financial institutions to help Africa. And then there's also a need to look at cross-border mobile banking to aid with payment services for the informal traders. The world has moved quite far, so and the contact and most people are having cell phones. If you're able to address a lot of the payment stuff with phones, you might solve a lot of the issues that occur at the borders. Moving on to the thick borders of Africa. So if you look at the sub-Saharan Africa, we find that it almost about 30 days to import and export goods. That is incredible. It takes you 30 days to import a good across the border from one country to another country. That is ridiculous. And if we had to further look at another example like the DRC and Rwanda, just at the border, and you're right there, to step over the border is what? One step to step across the border. You're going through one little blockade you're coming across. But effectively moving across that border that exists between two countries is the same thing as adding almost over 1,500 kilometers to your journey. That is how incredible work moving through the border between DRC and Rwanda is. And in terms of time, that is like adding 35 hours to your journey just moving across that border. So that is kind of an example of how thick our borders of Africa is. So importing and exporting of goods is not as simple as coming to the border and it's going to go immediately across. It just, there's like a lot of time wasted trying to move your good. I mean, it is actually quite ridiculous. So we look at a couple of organizations and we see Sub-Saharan Africa right at the bottom. Besides it taking incredible amount of time to move a good within a country and outside a country, besides taking incredible amount of time for good to move across a border towards our country, or to get to a product within a country, or across our border to get to another country, the time is not the only issue. Look at the cost. I mean, in terms of trying to import a container, it's 2,500 US dollars. That is so much more expensive than the next best of $1,845. Also, in terms of the exporting a container, 1,960. So our time delays is a lot, and the costs related to exports and imports is a lot. So that's a big problem that we face in terms of Africa. So trying to address the thick borders, if you look at it, a lot of the problem is in terms of infrastructure, transport, and telecommunications and energy. This is where the problems are. We have deficit in that sectors, and that causes 20% of delay. 80% of the rest of the delay is from non-tariff barriers and poor trade facilitation. So a lot of issues can just be handled from non-tariff barriers addressing, and in terms of infrastructure, transport, telecommunications, and energy problems. So we need to try to formulate some regulation that address both the hard and soft infrastructure stuff. Hard and soft infrastructure stuff we just discussed about. We also, in terms of issues, have the cost of cross-border payments. So there's very few, or if not any, financial instruments or institutions to help facilitate the payments and that. So usually what that means is the scarcity of these institutions, and then it's actually very expensive to exchange your currencies. People then try to extort extra money out of you for you to be able to get the type of currency you need to export or import this good across the border. So what ends up happening also, because there's not a lot of institutions for you to then use your credit card or debit card or banking facilities, and then you end up carrying a lot of cash. And with a lot of cash, it means it can be a lot of predatory behavior. So people can then exploit you, and that's what the officials do. They expect you to bribe them, or they ask of you of money to facilitate your import or export across the border. If you look in terms of modern technology, there's a lot of new products and services that do exist to help reduce this transaction cost. But however, it's not really like the operation between them. Just because one sector of the market is able to use it, one country, the next country isn't able to do it, or the side of the border is able to do this, and that organization is able to do that, but a lot of other organizations don't have these products or services, and that, so it causes a lot of issues and splits in the market in a sense. So that is the issue. It's no use to have the new products and services available, but not everybody has access to them, and not everybody uses them. So that causes a lot of issues between markets. And having them in place will save a lot of the operational times, and it will make a lot more. And then it will help with a lot of the efficiency between these agents and that. So there is one thing that we need to look at, and it's definitely at removing the non-tariff barriers. So by addressing them and trying to remove the unnecessary costs that we put on producers, which limits the trade, and usually then what results in increasing prices for consumers. This is in terms of removing non-tariff barriers. If we remove them, it will help with, or by them existing, right? By non-tariff barriers existing, we are causing unnecessary costs to producers. And then in the end, that means more higher prices for consumers. At the same time, by having non-tariff barriers, we are reducing the potential investments because there's a lot of uncertainty in trade. So we need to therefore have some need for having a report mechanisms and monitoring committees to help address these issues of non-tariff barriers. Having and putting these things in place is also cost, right? So just to bear in mind that to solve some of the problem, maybe the huge bulk of what the issue is, we need to have in place something that might to a degree cost money, but maybe less than what we are leaking or costing us in terms of time and everything. So we're not trying to remove any regulations. This is the deregulation part. But we're trying to rather implement better regulation that doesn't try to compromise on the health standards, and it is more focused on rather trying to promote regional competition and therefore better trade. So we're trying to bring in these private investors by addressing these issues, by having a more transparent approach and having placed things that will address any disputes in decisions made on regulations. And at the same time, what we're trying to do is have some form of common standards amongst African countries. So if everything is very similar, everybody is more familiar with certain things, and it helps with processing things a lot more faster. It helps with understanding in it. So let's look at some examples of NTVs that are causing some of the issues. So the first problem is delays at the border, which increase costs. Then we have the idea of restrictive rules of origin, which limit preferential trade. So we have onerous local content requirements, and then we have these costs for also the certificates related to these origins. So besides you having to make sure that a certain percentage of your product comes from the country that you're trying to export it to, you need to have a certificate that says that you have that percentage in it. So that's obviously additional cost. We also have the problems, another NTB that's the problem is the technical regulations and standards that are very poorly designed. And then we also have this idea that there must be mandatory inspections and certifications. And then we also have the idea that the national standards might be different from regional standards. So trying to have one type of standard would probably be better, because there's no use the regional standard is way different from a national standard. And which one is better, and then depends. So regional standard might be lower than what your national standard is. That means that you're never going to have any trade. You're not going to allow anything within your country if your standards are far higher than what the regional standard is. So standardizing these type of standards would really help. At the same time, we have that NTBs restrict opportunities for regional sourcing. That is maybe looking at the idea that, okay, I'm producing this type of good. For me to get this, I need this type of products. I want to source it through the border from another country that is within our regional area, so I can get it cheaper from here. But now I have these NTVs to bring this product into the country for me to produce, meaning the cost is going to be more expensive because of these hidden NTVs. Even though the products or the items I need for producing this good can maybe only be sourced from this regional country that is part of our agreement, or it's cheaper to source from there if we ignore the NTVs regarding bringing this good in. So there's some other forms of the NTVs that prevent the regional sourcing is this trade permits, export taxes, and import licensing. So it can occur in those type of forms, these restrictive opportunities for actually getting sourcing goods from the region. If you look in terms of the concentration of manufacturing goods, is then also looking at services as a source of diversification, especially considering that landlocked countries face high transportation costs. And if you address the issues on services and that, you can also then help aid growth. So we need to also then allow for opening services to trade that will help us to increase the quality and reduce costs, reduce waste, it improves management, and then it helps us also look at reducing operational costs. So when we look at trade liberalization, we need to ensure that this is not actually leading to transfer of ownership from a state monopoly to a private monopoly, or a national one to a foreign monopoly. So we need to have government also having a look at what is occurring here. And we look at some service issues, some examples of issues. So we don't have official payment systems on the cross border, and it's maybe due to the different regulation frameworks and financial institutions that occur between these countries. So trying to form one type of regional regulation and financial institution that is representative of the region is important then to be implemented. As I said, South Africa is really, Nigeria is really good in that sense. So maybe having them as a pushing force in trying to create these frameworks would be a good thing. And then we also lack distribution services that are modern nature. That would help small farmers to access high value markets and to accelerate their transition from subsistence farming to market participation. It's not that we don't have distribution services, it's not of the modern nature which we need to help in system. Moving to the Trade and Poverty paper, series 1, that is from May 2015. If we look at regional economic integration, it was used mainly to address growth and poverty issues. But if you look at a lot of poverty studies, we find that poverty is usually associated with low productivity. And if we want to reduce poverty, we need to have high production activities. And that will help to reduce poverty. This is just mainly an association process. And if we look at what the linear model is about, or the linear integration, it's all about trade reforms. And then that having a positive impact on trade and growth. And then with its benefits eventually filtering into the poor parts or the poor segments of society. So if we look at the linear model for Africa and its limitations, we find that we still have weak regional trade and poverty figures. And a way of addressing the weak regional trade and poverty figures, we thought, okay, trade liberalization is then very important to address those issues. And that these trade barriers are the main factor at affecting regional trade growth and eventual poverty reduction. So we are assuming here that the trade or these trade barriers are the ones that are affecting poverty, and that poverty has no effect on trade barriers. But the question then to ask is, does poverty not affect the ability of a country to trade, for instance, through the productive capacities that may be limited? So this one-year relationship that is one way relationship assumed by the linear model could in fact be the other way around. That even though we assuming that affecting or reducing or trying to have some form of trade liberalization to reduce poverty, we might have the other thing occurring, that the poverty is actually the one that's affecting our trade. And then by addressing poverty, we will then in fact be addressing a lot of our trade issues. So maybe having something that is targeted towards looking at poverty and then looking also at our trade liberalization, that would be really good for Africa's growth. So we also differ from why the EU's model has really worked. So all the EU countries, or most of them, or majority of them, all of them had high productive capacities. And this is different from African countries in that. We also don't have the energy and transport systems that they have. We have a lot of bottlenecks when you look in terms of energy and transport systems in Africa. So there's a lot of limiting factors from these energy and transport stuff. And the EU's transport system and energy system that exists is really, really efficient. And the institutional structural foundations from the EU were very similar to each other. So it allowed them to integrate more easier. While here in Africa, our institutional and our structural foundations are not easy to integrate. So we tried to follow a model that they followed, but the initial base was way better or more advanced than what Africa is. They had high production capacities. They didn't have any bottlenecks in terms of the energy and transport. The institutional and structural foundations were a lot similar to each other, so it allowed them to integrate better with each other. And we also, if you look at the weak links between regional organization and national government, that is also where Africa lacks. They have lots of weak links between these organizations, between government and between the regional government in a sense, or the regional organizations. While the EU has very strong links between their national governments and all the regional organizations that exist. So then to look at regional economic integration, we need to just not only look at that entirely on its own by looking at trade reforms, we must also look at development reforms. So we must try to have a new term for that would be maybe transformative regionalism. Just not looking at trade reforms, but also looking at terms of development. So we need to look at identifying the most binding constraints of development, and then ask how integration can help contribute to removing these constraints. So then we're looking at addressing both trade reforms and transformation reforms, and this will then help with reducing poverty and inequality. So in essence, we will try to then move with our linear integration and addressing some of our poverty and development growth, we were able to then move from a low productivity to high productivity activities. And in essence, this will then be reflected in higher real wages. So can this occur? This can only occur if we approach this transformative regionalism in a very strategic, coherent, and pragmatic way. We need to look at all the steps to achieve it and have in place all the ways to measure if we're actually having some progress. Government also needs to be there at the forefront to help with the process, and also then trying to involve the private sector to provide some effective leadership in all areas where integration is a problem, where it's challenging. You look at transformative regionalism through trading blocks. That is a bit of self-read. You can read about that in that paper. If you look at the way Africa has growth, or in terms of all the ideas they had in trying to have this transformative regionalism, so there was a lot of initiatives that took place, and almost all of them failed. So we had either one, either two. These are looking at the industrial development decade first in the 80s, and then the second industrial development in the 20s, and then we had the Alliance for Africa's Industrialization, which was launched in the late 90s. Then we also had another project called Accelerated Production Capacities, which were in the early 2000s. And then we had the Accelerated Industrial Development of Africa. This is the AIDA part of the thing, which happened in 2008. And then don't forget all the other things that we looked at in terms of other type of organizations like SADC and of SADC and the regional economic integration things that Africa, agreements that took place across Africa. And so all these things and all these initiatives and all these ideas never happened, never led to industrial growth in that sense. So we need to re-look at our regional economic integration process. We need to re-look at it. It's not a good idea. It says, okay, every decade or every 5 years, it says, okay, let's go forward. Let's do this. We put in all the plans, the ideas. We just say this is our growth phase, but there's not a lot of thought taking place in this. We'll be giving the same targets every time we start a new process. And we're not actually looking why, firstly, the first initiative or the initiative before that didn't work. So something for us to go and look at. We have with a lot of integration agreements, regional agreements, is that what has worked is in terms of our peace and security roles. Africa has generally been okay with that. A lot of countries have gone to assist other countries who had issues with peace and security. But maybe that being a core focus of our regional economic integration process, maybe that shouldn't be part of it. And that shouldn't maybe be left to other organizations like the African Union or other types of unions that exist to be their main form or their main objective. So we need to try to look at these processes and these regional economic integration, look in terms of it in terms of a transformative regionalism as the main focus for our agreements. And look at it in more in terms of a coherent integration. So we're trying then to use more effectively our scarce financial resources and our human resources, and then trying to align all our strategies of the African Union with those with the national governments. We also need a more pragmatic approach. We need realistic targets and deadlines, not saying we're going to do this in 3 years and we know it's not possible. And then we also have to look at the choices between market versus states, export orientated versus the import substitution. We need to address the idea of agricultural versus industrial development. And we need to say, okay, these choices are not independent, as I've shown before, and there needs to be a better look at them and not choosing between one and two, and that knowing that choosing the one might affect the other. We need to also look at industrial policy and making sure that that is also geared towards transformative regionalism. So we need to first look at it at national level first. So that's the investment, looking at the sectors that are most likely important, the most important sectors first. So we're strategic in the sense, it's like, okay, let's target the sectors that's best for each country. And looking at the structural change we need to do to help with these sectors. And then potentially unlocking more investment for them. And then in terms of regional thing, in terms of the regional level, we need to look at coherence across industrial strategies and policies. We need to also, from the industrial policy side, we need support from government in terms of looking out for the entrepreneurs and then to challenge them to perform effectively. Either we have to enforce this and try to establish some benchmarks that they need to reach. We also need to look at the consumer role. So we need to look at African consumer tastes and patterns and try to produce locally for what their tastes and they are. Because Africa's tastes and patterns are a bit different from the world. We can't just look outwardly and say, okay, this is what the production across the world looks like. Let's try to produce the same goods, and it actually differs from what actually we like as consumers in terms of Africa. So our consumers also need to appreciate and buy goods produced on this continent. So this is some pride we need to have in our own types of goods and that, and then try to create demand that way. We also need to look at enhancing or harnessing existing opportunities for industrial development, like in the agribusiness side. If we look at Nigeria, Nigeria produces a lot of tomatoes and they ship these tomatoes across the world. Guess what? Nigeria imports a lot of tomato paste. So why are they who produce tomatoes importing tomato paste? Why are not they not manufacturing or putting these tomatoes through a process that creates tomato paste? And then actually saving on the cost of actually now importing a good that they have the origin of production first. It's stupid. So some stuff like that need to be addressed. We also the need for the large African developers to assist. Yeah, I mean the big African countries to come and act as the forefront runners to help and assist the type of trade within Africa. So we're looking at Algeria, Egypt, Nigeria, and South Africa. We need them to play a more active role, and then also try to provide the finance and the cross-border infrastructure. So maybe they need to step in. Maybe other countries are a bit poorer, and we need these big powerhouses to come and help out. So they also need to act as the growth poles and promote development of regional production networks to catalyze trade and investment for sustained development in Africa. So they need to initiate a lot of the stuff and help and push us forward in that. So that's the end of all my video lectures. The lectures for the last 2 weeks or 3 weeks is through your peers are going to do that. Those are audio translations and that.